questions. I'm an expert on Parley Pratt, but I'm not an expert on early Park City, and those two can converge in a few ways, and I'll have some things to say about early Park City, but if you poke holes in my knowledge about early Park City, you'll find some gaps pretty quickly. So I'm going to start with a description of Parley Pratt's life that he wrote in 1853. The time he's 46 years old, and he's sitting inside a modest home just outside Temple Square in Salt Lake City. He's got a friend. He had received a letter from a boyhood friend who wanted a sketch of his life. Parley writes back, "Such a history would overload the mail. Would be far more strange to you than the 1,000 volumes of modern fiction." Against the background of their shared boyhood in the backwoods of New York, Pratt's subsequent life appeared improbable, even fantastic. Since that time, he traveled widely through the United States and Canada, led Latter-day Saint pioneer companies across past the moving masses of wild buffalo on the boundless, treeless plains to Utah, preached in San Francisco during the gold rush, crossed the Atlantic Ocean 6 times, and eaten figs from the tree in Chile. His life had been one of extremes, he wrote, of poverty and riches, peace and war, sublime joys and devastating sorrows. Controversy had stalked him, Pratt continued, as he had been received almost as an angel by thousands and counted an impostor by tens of thousands. 15 years previously in Missouri, he had lain months in gloomy dungeons and been loaded with chains. Though he'd been visited there, he said, by visions of angels and spirits and been delivered by miracles. As a defender of the Latter-day Saints, Pratt had publicly debated priests, learned men and infidels, stood before senators and governors, had edited periodicals and written published books. In his private life, Pratt would marry a dozen times and father 30 children. In short, he wrote, "I have been a farmer, a servant, a fisher, a digger, a beggar, a preacher, an author, an editor, a senator, a traveler, a merchant, an elder, and an apostle of Jesus Christ." He wrote his friend, "Is not truth stranger than fiction?" Pratt's literary instincts, I think, were correct. The narrative of his life could have formed the basis of a page-turning novel. By 1853, he had become, after Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, the most influential figure in shaping early Latter-day Saint history, culture, and theology, and of course, the early history and culture of pioneer Utah. Pratt exerted that influence across an astounding spectrum, excelling as a missionary, an explorer, a hymnist, pamphleteer, autobiographer, historian, and theologian. The final 4 years of his life would only solidify his place as one of the most engaging, colorful, and powerful figures in early Mormonism. In 1857, to the unrestrained cheers of the national media and the laments of the Latter-day Saints, Pratt was murdered in Arkansas by the estranged husband of his 12th wife. So that's just a kind of a snapshot of where he was and how he viewed his own life in 1853. Going to give sort of a little bit of an overview of his life and then focus on those Park City connections. So he's born to a poor family in New York in 1807. In the early 1820s, he strikes out on his own to the frontier of northern Ohio, where he converted to the religious message of the Campbellites, who modeled their religion on the primitive Christian church of the New Testament. Inspired by his newfound faith, Pratt became a freelance minister during the chaotic years of that era that we call the Second Great Awakening. But an encounter with the Book of Mormon in fall 1830 changed his trajectory. He converted quickly to the Latter-day Saints, and he added doctrines of priesthood authority to what he believed as a member of the Campbellites. The Book of Mormon excited his religious imagination. He saw it as a token of a sign of the second coming of Jesus Christ. And he was particularly interested in questions about American Indians and the origins of Indians. And he found, he believed, answers in that book. So he joins the infant church was at that point called the Church of Christ in September 1830, 6 months after its founding. Within a couple of weeks, Joseph Smith sends him on a mission to take the Mormon message to American Indians who were living in Missouri. Along the way, Parley says, let's stop in Kirtland, Ohio, because I know people there. And Pratt uses his connections in Kirtland to teach the Latter-day Saint message, and soon, within just a couple of months, there's 1,000 believers in Kirtland, and that draws the believers, the Latter-day Saints in New York, to Ohio. So it totally changes the geography of the church, right? Kirtland is now the center, and it's the center because Parley Pratt had taken the message there. So within a couple of years, in 1835, Parley Pratt is going to become one of the 12 apostles of the early church. This is the position he's going to hold for the rest of his life. And he's just 27 when he becomes an apostle. At the same time, his younger brother, who Parley has converted, becomes an apostle as well. And that brother's name is Orson. He's 23 at the time. And because of that apostolic position, he's really at the forefront of the church for the rest of his life. So when I wrote a biography of Parley Pratt, it's been about 10 years now. I wrote it with a historian, a literary scholar named Terrell Gibbons, and we called the title of the book Parley P. Pratt, the Apostle Paul of Mormonism. Let me tell you why we did that for a minute, because I think it speaks to why Pratt was important. There were really three main reasons that we called him the Apostle Paul of the Latter-day Saints. The first reason is that in early Christianity, Paul's writings, which include, at least the writings attributed to him, include 13 of the 27 canonical books of the New Testament. Paul's writings systematized and popularized Jesus's teachings. Parley Pratt's writings did the same for the early Latter-day Saint movement. His newspaper articles, pamphlets, and books explored the implications of Joseph Smith's revelations and the Book of Mormon, clarifying and expanding Latter-day Saint doctrines, including ideas that became very important to the Latter-day Saints, like the idea that God has a physical body, the idea that heaven is a reflection of relationships on earth, the idea that humans can become one day like God, and for Pratt as well, the religious rationale at that time for plural marriage. So one way to think about Parley Pratt is that he was the voice of the early Latter-day Saints. And that's really, he exerts his influence most powerfully through his writing. The early Latter-day Saint movement achieved its reach through both ambitious missionary work and an extensive print culture based in newspapers, pamphlets, and theological treatises. These aren't the sort of books that excite 21st century Americans. Most of you, I think, would have a difficult time reading some of Parley Pratt's works, but they did excite Americans at that time of the Second Great Awakening, when religion is just so much in the air and so much of the popular culture. So he really creates Latter-day Saint, what we can call print culture. He writes the first book of poetry for the Latter-day Saints, the first work of fiction, the first pamphlet, the first successful missionary work. He wrote more than 24 pamphlets arguing against the church's detractors and exploring its theology. In 1840, he founded a newspaper called the Latter-day Saints Millennial Star, which was the church's newspaper in England and is really central to how the church spreads in England. Three of his books are particularly important. I'll just mention them briefly. One is called A Voice of Warning. He writes this in 1837, and it becomes the principal missionary pamphlet for the Latter-day Saints in the 1800s. It sort of says, well, the title itself is "This is a Voice of Warning." This is a time when people believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ is at hand, and Pratt is calling them to the Latter-day Saint movement. The second book that's so influential is called Key to the Science of Theology. So think about that title for just a minute. The science of theology, right? Theology, religious doctrine, is something that can be systematized, something that can be, it's like science. There's rules to it, and you can work your way through it. It's really the first attempt by a Latter-day Saint to create a comprehensive theological system. Finally, before he dies, he writes an autobiography, which is unusual. He dies at the age of 50. And his autobiography becomes a classic in Latter-day Saint literature. It's fast-paced. It draws you in. And so the other thing to say about Parley Pratt and his writings is that he's comfortable with various literary genres. Like I said, he writes poetry and fiction, hymns, books. In England, he goes on a mission to England in 1840. He receives an assignment to publish a new hymnal. Parley Pratt writes to Brigham Young, "As to hymns, I'm writing several new ones every day, and in hopes to contribute 100 new ones to the volume we now print." So think about that, sitting down and trying to write several new hymns a day. And he overestimates what he can do. He doesn't get 100 in that hymnal, but he gets 50, which is a pretty impressive outpouring for a few months. So Parley's writings, as well as the writings of his brother Orson, converted thousands to the Latter-day Saints. In 1870, Edward Tollage, who was by this time a Latter-day Saint dissident, says that ask the people what brought them into the church, and you would hear from every direction Parley Pratt's voice of warning, or Orson Pratt's tracks, until it would almost seem to you that the Pratts created the church. Indeed, the best part of Mormon theology has been derived to a great extent from them. And so it may be said that they also, to a great extent, originated Mormonism. And I think Parley Pratt would say, would disagree with part of that. He would say, I didn't originate the religious ideas, but I explored them, I took them further, I systematized them, I popularized them, and so forth. So that's the first reason we said Parley Pratt is the Apostle Paul of the Latter-day Saints. The second reason is that in early Christianity, Paul is the Great Missionary. His extensive missionary travels helped put the Christian movement on the path from small sect to worldwide religion. Paul primarily proselytized in the great cities of the era, in the Jewish quarters of those cities of the northern Mediterranean. Similarly, Parley Pratt spends most of his time focused on large cities: Toronto, New York City, Manchester, Liverpool, San Francisco, Valparaiso, Chile. And he's one of the chief literary magazines of the day called him the chief of the Mormon missionaries. And the converts filled not only the church's rank and file, but also included future leaders such as John Taylor, who becomes the church's third president. The third reason that we call him the Apostle Paul is that he seems to revel in opposition and persecution. And in his own eyes, and the eyes of the Latter-day Saints, he met a martyr's death. When he was living in Nauvoo, Illinois, when the Latter-day Saints lived there in the early 1840s, his 5-year-old son, Nathan, dies. And he writes an obituary, and he says he died an infant, but he can say with Paul that he was in prison oft, in stripes more abundant, in tribulations and persecutions, in perils by the sea and land, in perils among robbers, and among false brethren. Parley Pratt viewed himself the same way. He'd spent 8 months in a Missouri prison as a consequence of his participation in a battle between Missourians and Latter-day Saints. He was held longer in prison than any other Latter-day Saint, and he compared that prison experience to Paul's own prison experiences. And interestingly enough, Parley Pratt doesn't just see himself as an object of persecution, but his writings shape a Latter-day Saint memory and collective identity that was forged in persecution, particularly in the expulsions from Missouri. To be a Latter-day Saint in the 19th century meant that you had a sense that you had been driven, that you'd been persecuted, that you'd been pushed out of successive states because of your religion. That really becomes central to how Parley Pratt and other Latter-day Saints saw themselves. So he writes a book called The History of the Late Persecution in 1839, which is all about the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from Missouri. So those are the sort of the I think the key points about why Parley Pratt is so important to the early Latter-day Saints. The first is that he's the voice of that early movement. The second is that is his missionary labors that bring so many into the church. And the third is that he really does help create this culture of collective identity that comes from persecution. So now let's get to Utah and let's talk about Park City a little bit. So in 1847, of course, you know that the Latter-day Saints crossed the plains under the leadership of Brigham Young, and they come to the Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young is at the head of a company of 143 people, I think it is. They, of course, get here late July. And when Brigham Young only spends about, I think it's 3, 4, 5 weeks in the Salt Lake Valley before he heads back for the winter to where most of the Latter-day Saints were, called winter quarters. He crosses on the trail Parley P. Pratt, leading a company that they called the Big Company. About 2,000 Latter-day Saints are going to arrive in the Salt Lake Valley that first year. So Brigham brings that pioneer vanguard company that kind of blazes the trail, gets to the valley quickly, sets things up there. And then Parley Pratt and John Taylor lead this much bigger company over the plains that arrives that same year in 1847. And that pioneer route that Brigham Young and Parley Pratt had followed a path blazed by the Donner Reed Party. You know what happens to them. So they blazed the path in 1846 from Fort Bridger, and that path goes down Echo Canyon and Emigration Canyon into the Salt Lake Valley. And it's a really tough road. There's 2 mountains in the way, there's windy canyons, there's steep descents, there's frequent crossings of streams. So one of the real things that the Latter-day Saints need to figure out in early Utah is, how do we get a better road into the Salt Lake Valley? Because this road down Echo and down Emigration Canyon is really tough. And of course, you can still go hiking on a lot of that road and see it for yourself. But they need to find an easier way. So in 1848, June 1848, so he gets to the valley in September 1847. The next June, Parley P. Pratt, alongside a man named Jacob Workman, explores what they call Big Canyon. And they go up Big Canyon, you know it as Parleys Canyon, and they go to the side of Park City. They explore an area that we now call Snyderville Basin, and they called it Parleys Park. Parley Pratt then goes back down to the Salt Lake Valley, and he gives a very excited report to Latter-day Saint leader. He says there's valuable timber and limestone in that area, the area of Park City. And he says we need to investigate more thoroughly and probably construct a road through the canyon. So there's at that point in early Utah, there's this mixing of civil and religious government. So the Latter-day Saint High Council is making the civic decisions. And so that council appoints Parley Pratt, his cousin, John Van Cott, and a man named Daniel Spencer to explore further in early July. After 3 days of that exploration, they returned, he says, weary and worn, some of us without shoes and nearly without pantaloons, the canyon having robbed us of these in a great measure, and so much of our flesh and skin. So it just sounds like they're kind of going, through pretty rough terrain. But they do report that a road through Big Canyon is possible. They say they can build it for $800, and that it would bypass that route down through Echo and Emigration Canyon, provide a better road into the valley. Now, part of the issue of why they need a better road is not just the Latter-day Saint pioneers that are already on the plains in summer 1848 coming across, but it's what has happened at Sutter's Mill in January of 1848. And of course, that's the discovery of gold. Within a year, thousands of the desperate and the hopeful are passing through Salt Lake City en route to California. The gold rush is really critical to early Utah because you have all these people passing through the Salt Lake Valley, and they're purchasing the Latter-day Saints supplies at inflated prices, and they're also selling to the Saints at discount prices, valuable and heavy merchandise that they loaded their wagons with, and they don't think they can get it to California anymore, right? So they're holding all these sales of the equipment, the 49ers are, as they pass through Salt Lake City. Pratt says, money and gold dust were plenty as the 49ers come through. Merchandise of every description came pouring into our city in great plenty. That infusion of cash helps the Saints begin ambitious immigration and colonization projects. So Parley Pratt moves quickly to capitalize. He received a commission from the Legislative Council of Deseret. They're calling their territory Deseret at this point. It hasn't been set up as a territory by the United States, but they've set up their own legislative council. And he gets the right to build a private toll road up Big Canyon. The Legislative Council gave other prominent Latter-day Saints rights to other canyons. So Parley Pratt basically has a private commission to build a toll road. He also has rights to build a sawmill. He sells those rights to another guy and sell woodlots in the canyon. So in July 1849, he begins work on the road, driven both by that economic opportunity of the gold rush and by his own financial necessity. Sometimes I think there's a perception that a lot of these leading Latter-day Saints at this time period became quite wealthy. And there's some truth to that. I mean, you can go downtown to Salt Lake City and you can see Brigham Young's Lion House and this Beehive House and that sort of thing. But Parley Pratt is basically always scraping to get by. And he's got this large family to support, so part of it's just his own financial necessity. He hires some of the 49ers who arrived in Salt Lake utterly worn out, teams and wagons in a bad condition, and they're hoping to make a little money so they can continue on to California. He also brings with him one of his plural wives, Anne Agatha Walker Pratt, along with his son, Parley Jr., who's 14 at the time. No, excuse me, he's 11 at the time. And Anne Agatha brings along an infant daughter. And Anne is there to cook for the camp. And she recalled the food consisted mostly of bread baked in bake kettle, meat, coffee, and a little butter. We had a small tent and a wagon to sleep in. We would make camp in a shady place near the creek. We would stay there till about 2 miles of road was made, then move camp and make another mile or two. On another occasion, she said, as a group of men were busy chopping down trees about a mile above the camp, a large grizzly bear approached, forcing the men to climb trees for safety. By November, when they ceased work for the year, the road was completed from Salt Lake to the Weber River. As they journeyed home, Agatha said, let me get out of the wagon where the road is rough. But Parley asked her to ride the entire way so he could say that a woman and a baby came down the entire road in safety. That next spring, they again commenced working on the road in what they're still calling Big Canyon, and in also harvesting some timber from the canyon. This time, another of his plural wives, Elizabeth Brotherton Pratt, accompanies him as a cook, and he has a small crew of Latter-day Saint men to do it. One of those was a man by the name of John Pulsifer. He writes of this experience that Parley Pratt was a strong, healthy man and a very hardworking man. One of the best men I ever worked with. He was full of the gospel. His conversation was instructive and exalting. As they worked that spring near the Weber River, which was full and rapid from the melting snow, the men left Elizabeth Brotherton and Parley Jr. to look for a suitable place to ford the river. They soon heard cries for help and rushed back. John Pulsifer found Elizabeth in the water, hanging to a bush with one hand and hanging onto little Parley with the other. She'd been picking berries along the river when the river bank collapsed under both she and Parley Jr. The men came just in time to save her, as just her head and arms were above the water, and she had nearly lost hold of the bush. She was scared and chilled and trembled for hours. After working a few more months that spring, Pratt announces in the newly launched Deseret News that his road, which he calls the Golden Pass, would open about July 4th, 1850, that would connect the Weber River and the Salt Lake Valley, avoiding those two great mountains and most of the canyons so troublesome of the old route. From Echo Canyon, the road passed present Colville, Hoytsville, Wanship, traveled up 3 Mile Canyon to the present Silver Creek Junction on I-80, then descended down what we call Parleys Canyon into the Salt Lake Valley. The toll station was in southeast Salt Lake City, near 33rd East and 21st South. Parley wrote, "If a road worked by the most persevering industry and open country, good feed and fuel, beautifully romantic and sublime scenery are any inducement, take the new road," and thus encourage public improvement. He charged 50 cents per wagon if drawn by one animal, 75 cents if you had 2 animals on your wagon. An additional pack or saddle animal cost 10 cents. Loose stock was a nickel, and sheep were a penny apiece. Now, when he advertised the road, Parley Pratt said, "The road is somewhat rough and unfinished. It's being made better every day, though," he said. Travelers agreed with at least half of what he said there. In August 1850, an English immigrant named Mary Ann Weston Maughan called it the most dreadful road imaginable. She wrote, "Some places we had to make the road before we could pass it. It is so full of large rocks and stumps." She grumbled that they paid for the privilege of passing over the road we had made. Nevertheless, Parley Pratt earned about $1,500 in tolls that year, serving travelers to California, Latter-day Saint immigrants, local saints seeking timber and stone up the canyon. On the cusp of financial success, though, missionary duty again trumped the prosperity that he was seeking. He was called on a mission by Brigham Young to California and Chile. So he sold his interest in the road to several other individuals in early 1851 to finance his mission. Nevertheless, the route became known as Parley's Road and the canyon as Parleys Canyon. The road soon fell into disrepair, though appropriations by the territorial legislature continued to make it passable in the 1850s, and it became the preferred route into the valley by the 1860s. And of course, the route eventually became the site of Interstate 80. Let me, maybe I'll talk for just about 5 more minutes, and maybe I'll say just a few words about his family, and then we can take any questions. Obviously, very unusual family by our standards. As a young man, he married his first wife, a woman by the name of Thankful Halsey, who also converted to the church and supported him in his missions until she died in childbirth with their first son, Parley Jr., in 1837. He then married a widow, Mary Ann Frost Stearns, and then at that time, the church, Joseph Smith, began teaching the principle of plural marriage. Both Parley and Mary Ann Pratt accepted that principle together. Parley Pratt married his first plural wife in 1843. He eventually married 12 women in his lifetime and was the father of 30 children. One of the things that was so interesting to me as I wrote the book, Parley's autobiography is like most 19th century autobiographies, or like the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and these classic American autobiographies, that he just doesn't talk about his family. But there's a really rich set of correspondence between Parley and his wives, and between the wives themselves. And the wives describe a generally harmonious household. And there's these letters of real, I think, genuine affection that pass among the family. Now, his final wife, a woman by the name of Eleanor Jane McComb, had converted to the church while living in California. According to her account, her husband, Hector McLean, was an abusive alcoholic who sent their 3 children to live with her parents in New Orleans after she was baptized. Because of her husband's abuse, she said she left him and moved to Salt Lake City. At a time when divorces were very difficult to obtain, Eleanor, like many other 19th century Americans in similar circumstances, considered her marriage ended, even though she and Hector McLean were not legally divorced. She married Parley Pratt in 1855 and accompanied him on a mission to the eastern states, hoping thereby to retrieve her children from her parents' home. Her father alerted her estranged husband of her attempt, and the estranged husband, Hector McLean, convinced an Arkansas marshal to arrest Parley Pratt in May 1857. The case was brought to a federal court in Arkansas, and the federal judge postponed the case and went to Parley Pratt early the next morning and said, "Here's my horse, here's my pistol. There's nothing to hold you. You haven't committed a crime, but I'm pretty sure the jail's being watched. So good luck." Parley said, "I'll take the horse, but not the pistol." Some miles from the jail, McLean, who was watching the jail, and a few associates track him down and kill him. And the Latter-day Saints really just deeply mourn the loss. He was really popular figure among the Latter-day Saints. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. I just want to share a few images. So can you see the PowerPoint? Okay, it looks like we've got a nod or two. So I'll just gotta start it up here. So this is his voice of warning, one of the editions of the voice of warning. I'm just going to show you a few images of Parley. This is him and his wife, Belinda Martin Pratt, taken in 1851. So a year after he opens the toll road. There's a side view in the 1850s, and another view of that same photo shoot, and then here he is again. Most of the images that we have come from the 1850s. Photography is really just kind of getting its start. Before that time, it's kind of mid 1840s that it starts to become accessible to more people. This is Parley and his wife Elizabeth Brotherton. She's the one that's holding onto the branch in the creek and holding onto Parley Jr. So this isn't the best image, but at the historic place of the beginning of the toll road, which is at the mouth of Parleys Canyon, 21st South, 23rd East, in Salt Lake, there's this statue that was put up. I think it's been about 25 or 30 years now. The sculptor's man by the name of Ed Fraughton, and it's Parley Pratt with his surveying equipment, looking up Parleys Canyon, as part of that work. Unfortunately, last fall, this happened. November 16, 2020, about 9:30 in the morning. There's a brake failure of a big semi truck that's coming down the hill, and just takes out Parley Pratt and the statue there. If the statue may not have been there, they probably would have gone into the parking lot or potentially further of the Smith's grocery store that's right there on the corner as well. So Ed Fraughton, I mentioned, he's a sculptor. He is working on repairing the statue, and it's kind of unknown at this point if it's going to be put back in the same place or positioned somewhere else in Salt Lake. So great. Well, I see some questions, so maybe I can just spend a little bit of time with the questions. Will the Parley Pratt Memorial be rebuilt on Parley's Way? That's the statue I just showed you. So it is in the process of being repaired, and so that's good news. Well, when Parley spent time in jail, what was the charge? So I'll mention a couple of jail experiences that he has. One of the classic stories in Parley's autobiography is as of a time that he's imprisoned as a missionary in 1830, and he tricks the jailer in the morning, and the jailer says, you know, at this time the person being held would often kind of have breakfast with the jailer, and Parley Pratt says, "How fast are you?" to the jailer, and the jailer says, "You know, I'm kind of old. I'm not super fast, but my dog can. He's really fast, and he would take down any man who tried to escape." And Parley Pratt said, "Well, I think I'm going to try." And so he takes off running, and the jailer says, "Stew Boy," which is the dog's name. He says, "Stew Boy, you know, go get him." And Parley Pratt, when the dog gets up back to Parley Pratt stops and says, Stew Boy, go get him," and points off in the woods. And the story that Parley tells is the dog just runs into the wood and Parley takes off in the other direction. So of course that's just a night in jail, and it seems like that's probably connected to some debts that he had left behind because he had earlier lived in that area. When he's imprisoned for 8 months in Missouri, so this is at the end of what's sometimes called the Missouri Mormon War, and there's been battles in Missouri, and it's a really confusing scenario because it's not clear who is militia and who are vigilantes. And some of these battles take place between different units of the state's own militia. So the Latter-day Saints have a unit of militia, and then there's other units of militia who are very anti-Mormon. And so Parley's involved in one of these clashes called the Battle of Crooked River. And it's an attempt by the Latter-day Saints to get back a few men who'd been taken prisoner by the Missourians. Now, in the battle, men die on both sides. A couple of men on both sides. The Latter-day Saints lose one of their apostles named David Patton, and a couple of Missourians are killed. So when the Latter-day Saint city of Far West is taken, is sort of captured at the end of that Mormon Missouri War, one of the legal strategies by the state of Missouri is to find as many of the men who participated in the Battle of Crooked River and hold them all for murder, because a couple of men and the militia died. And so there's no indication that Parley Pratt had like actually fired the gun that had killed the man on the other side, but someone had died in this battle. And so a lot of Latter-day Saint men are held, at least for a period of time, on charges of murder for Crooked River. So it's a very serious charge, right? I mean, Parley could die because of that. So that's the charge. Tell us more about Parley's last days. Well, my goodness, there's a lot of great questions here. I'll hold on that one, and I think I'll cover it below with one of the other ones. Do you know who he sold the Golden Pass Road to? Why did it fall into disrepair? Will Bagley theorized that it was too easy for disillusioned saints to use and leave the valley and return west. So Brigham Young closed it. I'd have to look back in my research notes to see who he sold it to. I think I would dissent from Will's interpretation. There were always roads in and out of the Salt Lake Valley, even at that time, kind of the hottest time of that period that Will Bagley focuses on, of the Mormon Reformation and the Utah War in 1856, 1857. Even during that time, there's good roads out of the Salt Lake Valley. So I don't know the exact kind of history. My interest in the toll road declined after Parley sold it, since I was most interested in his story. But I would be really surprised if it was kind of a conscious decision of Brigham Young to like hem in people in the valley, because they're never hemmed in. There's always huge amounts of movements in and out of the Salt Lake Valley. So sometimes we have this idea that the Salt Lake Valley is really isolated in the 1850s and 1860s, and there's some truth to that, right? I mean, it is a distance from other things, but there's always people coming and going, large groups of immigrants, the 49ers, and the 49ers just don't come in 1849, right? This is a movement for years and years where people are passing through the Salt Lake Valley to get to California. Sorry, I don't know some of the specifics there. Before the road, how did Parley make a living? Well, so some of the time he's a farmer. So he does have farms, particularly in his early life, and he's got a farm in the Salt Lake Valley. So that's part of it. A lot of the times when he's on missions, people are helping support the family. And he's Latter-day Saint missionaries at that time are often travel by what they call without purse or scrip, which means I'm going to live off donations that people give me, both people in and out of the church. So that's how he's doing a lot of the missionary work. He also tries to make a living as a writer, which making a living as a writer is really tough right now, and it was really tough in the mid-19th century. And so he does make some money off of Voice of Warning and some of the other books, but it's just kind of barely enough to keep him afloat. Covered his death. Did his body make it back to Utah? So no. The Parley Pratt's killed in May 1857 outside a city called Van Buren, Arkansas, and he's kind of killed on the property. I mean, he's not kind of killed. He's killed on the property of a local farmer, and they bury him. There's kind of an inquest into his death, and then he's buried sort of near the family cemetery of this farmer. Now, the farmer does record that Parley Pratt had said while he was dying, "I want my body to be taken back to Utah." Of course, that's not really feasible in the mid-19th century, right? There's no good way to do that, even if the Latter-day Saints had the resources and the will to go and do that. There was a sort of an archaeological dig at his gravesite about 15 or 20 years ago that tried to identify exactly where his gravesite was, but no remains were identified from that archaeological dig, which the local coroner said didn't surprise him, because I'm not an expert on this, but the soil was so acidic in that area of Arkansas that if you buried someone within 80 or 100 years, you probably wouldn't find anything. Next question. The popular story is that one of George Snyder's wives named Parley's Park. Do I have a different view? I don't. That's not something I tried to figure out at any kind of deep level. So the popular story sounds good to me. Was Mount Air Canyon involved with Parley and the toll road? I'm going to have to say I don't know on that either. I'm not totally even sure that I know where Mount Air Canyon is, so excuse my ignorance on that one. What happened to the guy who killed him and the wife. So maybe there was kind of another question here about his death. So I'll say just a little bit more there. And if anyone's got a question, I think we're kind of at the end of the questions after this. So Eleanor McLean Pratt was with Parley Pratt when he's taken into custody. And she at that time has the 3 children with her. And part of what had prompted Eleanor to leave Hector McLean is that he had threatened to institutionalize her in an asylum because of religious fervor. And like the first time I read that story, I'm like, well, that can't be right? I mean, you don't like lock people up in asylums because they're like too religious. But actually, that was a thing that happened in the mid 1800s. You could lock people up. The family could say, this person, they're too religious. They got these crazy religious ideas. They're insane. And Eleanor is really in a difficult situation there, where legitimately, if she was taken before a judge, and she's a Latter-day Saint in a very anti-Mormon society, she could have been institutionalized. So that's one of the reasons why she leaves, goes to Salt Lake. And really it seems like kind of what's driving Eleanor is to retrieve her children. I can't remember the ages, but it's something like 8, 10, and 12. I mean, they're relatively young. So she goes to, while Parley Pratt, they travel to the east together. Parley does missionary work in places like New York, and she goes to New Orleans. And she goes to her family, and it's her own parents now who have custody of her children. And they say, "Are you still Latter-day Saint?" She's like, "Nah, I've left that behind." So she kind of gets back into their confidence, their good graces. And then after about a month, she takes off with the kids. And of course, there's no court that's going to settle this custody battle in a way that we would recognize. And so she leaves with the children. She writes a letter to Parley Pratt and says, meet us in Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma, which is next to Arkansas. So he's going there to meet them. And when Hector McLean and then Marshall catch up to Parley Pratt and Eleanor and the kids, the only way that they can charge Parley is by the charge literally is that he stole the clothes that the children were wearing. And so it's on that charge that he's taken back to Arkansas, and the federal judge releases him, and then Hector McLean kills him. So what happens to Hector McLean? There's no like legal ramification for having killed Parley Pratt. I mean, he's really seen as a hero. In 1857, this is really kind of high point or low point, depending on how you see it, for public opinion of the Latter-day Saints. There's an army on the way to Utah to install a new governor to replace Brigham Young. There's lots of stories about Latter-day Saints disloyalty to the government and things like this. So there's no bill anywhere to hold Hector McLean account. I think he goes back to San Francisco and lives out his life there. The children are returned to Eleanor's parents, and they're raised apart from Eleanor. She returns to Salt Lake City and lives with the Pratt family, and she's a school teacher in Salt Lake City until she dies, I think, in the late 1860s. And the Pratt family, after Parley's death, I mean, they were poor while he was alive, but they were really poor after he died. Eleanor and some of the other wives who die in the 1860s and 1870s are all buried in the pauper section of the Salt Lake City Cemetery. So anyway, all right, is any final questions? I feel like I've just been on a monologue here for like 55 minutes, but I appreciate the question. But if someone else wants to say something, that'd be awesome.
Does anyone have anything to say, add, to ask? Anyone? No?
Well, if not, I'll just say thanks so much. This has been fun for me, and it's been great to do. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Matt, for joining us tonight. I learned a lot, so it was very interesting. So thank you again. Thanks everyone for coming. Check out our lecture series on the website, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again, Matt.
Okay, see ya.
Thank you.
Okay.